This video, and this series especially, that is Budget Gourmet, is brought to you by the good folks at KEH. Not only is KEH the oldest and biggest at what they do, buying and selling exclusively used camera gear of all sorts since 1979, but they do it well, with integrity and both a 180-day warranty and 21-day return policy, free shipping on transactions over $49. Which is why, because they make it as futz-free a process as possible, they are our go-to whenever we are looking to fund new purchases by selling our own gear or buying that special used piece of kit properly graded and checked when we want to go quirky or old school. Check them out by clicking on the links in the description below and get 5% off when you buy using the discount code HughShop, a 5% bonus when you sell using the discount code HughBonus. Thank you, KEH. Hey everybody, I'm Hugh Brownstone for Three Blind Men and an Elephant, and welcome to this very special Leica M edition of Budget Gourmet. There is so much to cover that we're not going to be able to do it all in a single video, but oh well, let's start. Now, Leica and budget, interesting juxtaposition, right? Not two words normally found in the same sentence. Yet, in an era when a new Leica M body will set you back anywhere between, call it, $5,000 for the Altaschule 35mm film only MP or MA, and a cool $9,000 for a new digital M10R or M10 monochrome. Leica M lenses cost anywhere between $2,400 for their petite Elmert M 28mm f2.8 aspherical made in Portugal, and a smidge more than 14 large for their beautiful, built like a brick house Noctilux M75 1.25. I mean, we're talking Tesla Model 3 territory for a complete kit. There are less expensive paths, sometimes dramatically less expensive paths, to the Leica M shooting experience. But the very first question is, what is the Leica M shooting experience for you? Because it absolutely means different things to different people. Is it, for example, the talismanic quality, I call it, the history and heritage of the most iconic camera brand of all time, something you can practically feel every time you pick one up that most speaks to you? Is it the image quality from such small jewel-like lenses, the Leica look, the act of focusing through an optical viewfinder integrated with a rangefinder patch, dynamic range limited only by one's eye? The simplicity of the shooting experience, the absence of today's mind-boggling array of function buttons, dials, and menu options. The tactile sensation of shooting with a purely mechanical camera, with the earliest M variants not even needing a battery. Maybe it's the petite, unobtrusive size of the camera with a couple of lenses, no backpack or messenger bag necessary. Maybe a quiet, though not silent shutter. So quiet, however, that back in the 20th century, several states here in the U.S. actually required cameras in courtrooms to operate at or below noise levels set by the Leica standard. Perhaps the experience of shooting with actual film and the surrounding silver halide processes, from loading to developing and printing in an honest-to-goodness darkroom yourself. Then again, why limit ourselves to the M at all? Why not include the pre-war Leica rangefinders or the post-war, post-rangefinder Leica Flexes and Leica Rs? One can, in fact, get into either system for far less than an M. But let's hold those thoughts for now, with the hope that if you aren't perfectly clear about your answer to these questions, you will be by the time we get to the end of this multi-part special edition of Budget Gourmet, and be able to choose and enjoy your gear accordingly. In the meantime, I'll share with you my own thoughts as a way of prompting your own thinking, but once again, that's just me. First, we're talking about the M rather than other Leica rangefinders because an M is simply much easier to use than the pre-war Leica rangefinders with far superior lens options. Second, it is not a Me Too system, as one can argue the original Leica Flex was, a relatively late entrant to the SLR market, nor was it created in partnership with any other camera company. One might thus say that it is the purest expression of Leica DNA from 1954 forward, when it was first introduced, with a clear lineage back to the Leica of, well, 1914 actually, and might agree. What is not subject to personal opinion is the fact that the M is the longest-running camera series in Leica's history, now in its 67th year of production, which is a pretty darn good reason why in the minds of most photographers, I think. The M system is also probably most closely associated with the Leica name and Leica's breakthrough popularization of and preeminence within the 35mm film format. Never mind the extraordinary number of extraordinary images captured with a Leica M by some of the greatest photographers of all time. It doesn't hurt either that even now one has the choice of entering the M system through film or digital using the same lenses and essentially the same manual of arms in one of the most compact full-frame systems out there, film or digital, especially when one considers lens size arguably the most future-proof camera of all time. Oh, and then there's this. The M is clearly the most sought-after kind of Leica in the used market, and it just might be the most beautiful camera ever built. No, it is the most beautiful camera ever built. All of it matters to me, but for me, an M is most especially that talisman, a tangible mechanical portal to the 20th and 21st centuries, the lens, no pun intended, through which I experience human history. It is unique in its ability to practically whisper into my ear, do better. Make your photography count. And when I do my best, Leica gives its best right back to me, both in terms of the process and the final image. Of course, you may have a completely different perspective, and I'd love to read about it in the comments section. So, with that out of the way, let's get down to brass tacks and the purpose of this series, to get that Leica experience, however one defines it, for less. There are only a few legitimate ways to spend less for Leica gear. 1. Buy used, as in buy used factory original Leica M only gear. No substitutes, no third-party interlopers, no adaptation even of our lenses. 2. Buy different, as in buy used or new gear from different brands that are Leica M compatible, from Voigtlander Bessa and Zeiss Icon bodies to M-mount lenses from those two manufacturers and many others. 3. Think differently, as in buy used or new gear, which gives you what you want of the Leica experience, Leica or not, rangefinder or not, film or not, which I think is intriguing. Now, we'll be taking each of these approaches in turn over a number of videos, but today it's all about buying original Leica M gear and only original Leica M gear used. So let's get into it. First and foremost, I like buying used classic Leica M series lenses. And by this, as I just said, I mean original Leica M lenses, not Leica R-mount lenses from Leica, M-mount lenses from third parties, or lenses of any other mount adapted to M-mount. And I like mint condition. There are a number of reasons to pursue this path. 1, lenses, especially classic M lenses, are, in the end, relatively simple things with relatively few moving parts and no electronics, a distinct advantage over Leica bodies, film or digital, as well as a distinct advantage over more modern autofocusing lenses. There's simply less to go wrong, less to repair, fewer spare parts to run out of. Although, I do wish Leica M glass could auto-magically provide EXIF data to the body so that I'd know the actual aperture used rather than being provided the educated guess the newest digital M's offer. 2. Classic Leica M lens design and material choices date back to an era not that far distant from the building of the Brooklyn Bridge, which is to say, an era in which impermanence was, at least for stuff like this, an alien concept. Things were built to last, period. 3. In other words, the longevity of Leica lenses in particular, and their suitability as used items often operating almost as if new, is a demonstrable fact. 4. Which wouldn't matter if they weren't optically superb, but many, if not all lenses, are not only overbuilt, but one could argue over-engineered for the film era in which they were first created. Such lenses can easily resolve beyond the limits of 35 film, and the lenses I'm going to recommend to you today only look better as you throw more megapixels at them. At least, that is so far up to the 40 megapixels of the M10R and M10 monochrome. 5. As I said a few moments ago, Leica lenses ooze heritage and human history. Okay, that didn't sound quite right, but you get my meaning. M lenses, even ones produced today, have a lineage and DNA, if you will, to a time of handcrafted excellence. This is a significant component, for me, of their value as a portal to the past. I connect them to the human beings who designed and built them. 6. Given all of these things, it is thus the case that one can often buy used Leica lenses at significant discounts to new and have the build quality, optical quality, industrial design, feel in hand, compact dimensions, and heritage which incent someone like me, at least, to want to do so. 7. Mint condition will, all else being equal, give me the longest time with a lens with the least futzing or worry, and I am willing to pay extra for that. Finally, 8. While one can argue either side of the assertion that new Leica lenses depreciate more slowly than any other brand, functions primarily, one might suppose, of reputation, actual optical and build quality, scarcity, and historical importance, it is probably easier to agree that A. Used Leica lenses depreciate more slowly than new ones. B. Less expensive new Leica lenses depreciate less on an absolute basis than higher-priced new ones, all else being equal. C. Used Leica lenses have a higher probability of actually appreciating versus new ones in the medium term. And D. Leica camera bodies, especially digital bodies, do not hold their value as well as lenses in any case. This is a function of several things. First, camera bodies in general are far more complicated than lenses, subject to much greater and harsher repetitive use, wear, and tear. As in, every time one trips the shutter or winds film. Save, say, for disposable cameras and view cameras, actually, the latter being little more than a light-tight box, the shutter built into the lens rather than the body, as most of you know, and advancing from one frame to the next is accomplished usually by manually swapping dead simple film holders. This said, classic rangefinder film cameras especially require a level of care, cleaning, and calibration far beyond what is required of manual focus-only lenses and require more spare parts. Although film M's have stood the test of time and apparently can be repaired long after digital M's, at least certain ones, cannot. Especially fully manual M's, no batteries necessary, thank you very much, which makes for a very interesting comparison to digital M's and, once we look farther afield, Leica's latest autofocusing lenses. As Leica's chairman, Dr. Andreas Kaufmann himself told me, we simply do not know how long they will last. In Leica terms, the digital era of photography is too new and too short to predict the longevity even of something as robustly engineered and built as an SL2. Second, digital camera bodies have inherently shorter lives not only by virtue of complexity, but by virtue of obsolescence. Once any product is dependent on Moore's law for its appeal, there will always be something better just a few years out. This was simply not the case, at least not the same way during the film era. Although I will tell you that in my opinion, the Apo-Summicron SL Primes created for the SL series bodies are the best lenses optically that Leica has ever made, the best lenses I've ever seen, so good that I have personally invested in an SL2 and an Apo-Summicron SL35, and I fully expect both to outlast yours truly. So, with about 2,000 words worth of preamble, here with my top picks for used Leica gear, very personal picks, beginning with a budget gourmet lens trio, truest to the original Leica M experience as I see it, a complete street photographer's kit I am 2/3 of the way through owning, and one other Leica M lens I'd call an extremely nice to have bang for the buck optic. First in that trio, a 5th generation Summicron M 50mm f2, which is still being made today, the only difference being that the newest versions come with 6-bit coding allowing the camera to recognize which lens it is. 2. The final generation Elmert M 90mm f2.8, for which production ended in 2008. And 3. The Elmar M 24mm f3.8 aspherical, introduced in 2006, and discontinued just last year in 2020. Note that this trio is based on essentially narrowing the field of view between each lens by half as we move from shortest to longest focal length, a usefully large but still manageable gap when zooming with one's feet, or working with a high-resolution sensor. The one lens I'm adding to this list violates this pattern and comes with the added caveat that it's a bit big for the truest Leica experience, but oh baby, Leica's still in production Apo-Telit M135 3.4 is sweet. Let's get into the details of each of these lenses, beginning with the lens I'd always reach for first, that classic Summicron M 50mm f2 Type 5. Simply put, I think the 50 is the one lens to have if you're having only one. It is not only smaller, lighter, and less expensive than what is generally regarded as the more desirable Summilux 51.4, but the Cron is actually sharper too. And it truly does render differently than any other 50 f2 I've ever used. Gorgeous focus fall off with bokeh and a depth of field wide open that somehow belie its f2 maximum aperture, sharpness that belies the age in which it was first developed. Sure, it's one stop slower and not quite as bokeh-dacious as the Lux, but it's closer than you think, and it blocks less of the viewfinder too. I picked up mine a couple of years ago in absolutely mint condition, manufactured in 1997 for $1,800, which is around a third off the price of a new one, but just about double what one might have cost used a decade ago. You could, of course, buy an earlier version, or you could buy an even newer version with 6-bit coding, but in reverse order, A, it's easy enough to tell the camera body what lens you've attached to it, and B, even when the optical design and lens materials are the same, as they are for several generations of the Chron, I'd rather not deal with lenses made earlier than the 1990s. Now, I was about to tell you to hold that thought about viewfinder blockage, but let's deal with it straight up. Because if you want the full Leica M experience, that is, you want to focus using the viewfinder, you want to travel small and light, you want to be inconspicuous, lens size matters, as in small size matters. Beyond the usual considerations of size and weight, you want to block as little of the viewfinder as possible. All of which argue for the smallest lenses possible for a given focal length. I personally care more about viewfinder blockage than I do maximum aperture, not only because precise framing is critically important to me, but also because this overall small size and weight without compromising the view is, as I just said, a key attribute of the original Leica M system experience. But it's even more than that. I care less about maximum aperture when it comes to the M system, because I personally find rangefinders absolutely harder and slower to compose and focus precisely than SLRs or DSLRs in anything other than low light. Harder to focus than the best mirrorless camera in any situation. Especially harder to focus or precisely compose when dealing with very shallow depth of field. Harder to impossible to expose precisely when shooting with anything north of 50 millimeters or south of 28 millimeters, or when faced with large, rapidly changing subject-to-film or sensor plane distances. I am, of course, excluding zone focus from this particular discussion at this point, but I am talking about the fact that a rangefinder-based viewing and focusing system is not a what you see is what you get proposition from either a composition or exposure perspective. It does suffer from parallax to varying degrees, has a limited field of view, which requires a separate optical finder when you go wider than 28, sometimes wider than just 35, as in the original M3s or the M6 TTL 0.85x magnification finders, and has a very small area within the viewfinder's frame lines when going to a lens 75 millimeter or longer. There is a reason Leica developed separate finders and goggles for their longer lenses in the last century. Coming back to the here and now, take Leica's $13,700 90mm 1.5 Lux or $14,400 75 1.25 Noctilux as examples. Both are gorgeous in hand and can produce breathtaking clarity and subject isolation, but it is very difficult for me anyway, doing what I do, to consistently nail focus wide open. You try to consistently nail focus on a 91.5 with a depth of field of just 0.6 of an inch at 4 feet, let alone a depth of field of 0.5 of an inch on a 75 1.25 at 3 feet 4 inches for the same field of view through an integrated rangefinder viewfinder window. And if you do nail focus, the depth of field might still be too shallow. Of course, your mileage may vary, and as always, that's fine. You just might actually be able to do that and find the right artistic expression for that capability, in which case, bravo. What's fascinating to me is that most people don't appreciate that the M, like all rangefinder cameras before it, was generally shot with the focus preset, as was the aperture at a sufficiently small f-stop by the photographer to obviate the need for focusing real-time altogether through the viewfinder. That is, no futzing, no missing the shot. The real kick in the head implication of this? That in its most natural state, at its fastest and most fluid, the M system, in fact, all true rangefinder cameras were, in their heyday, used as relatively deep depth of field point and shoots. Ultra high quality point and shoots, sure. Inspiring point and shoots, yes. Talismanic point and shoots, oh baby. But this, that is, not missing the shot because of focus, is why the legendary Life magazine photographer Alfred Eisenstadt, as just one example, used zone focusing to capture his iconic VJ Day image in August of 1945, using a predecessor to the M, the dual-window Leica 3A, with optional Vio Finder, in fact, to make seeing and composing easier, and why so many photographs shot with true rangefinders do not evince shallow depth of field. That, and the fact that fast lenses were and still are today also always bigger, more expensive, and not as sharp wide open as slower lenses, often even when stopped down. And because the raison d'etre for the inventor of the Leica, Oscar Barnack, was to have a small, lightweight camera for hiking, where landscapes were the order of the day. And between bright daylight, the often great distances between subject and film plane, great depth of field and ultimate sharpness required anyway, fast precision focus was not necessary. Let us continue. Why 50 millimeters, you may be wondering. How, you may be asking yourself, could you ever leave either a 35 or 28 out of the running, especially for street photography? Hey, Hugh, it might suddenly dawn upon you to ask quite directly. Didn't you own and love a Summicron M35 spherical? Great questions, and yes, I did. But when I bought my M8 along with a Summicron M35 f2 spherical, and added an Elmert M92.8 more than a decade ago, maybe a decade ago, what I was really doing was buying focal length, which I knew well, and would give my favorite fields of view for 99% of my work, given that sensor, the full frame equivalents of 50 and 135 for general photography, street photography, and portraiture. If you were to buy an M8, I would tell you to get the 35 Cron spherical, absolutely, over an earlier vision of the Cron, or Summilux. A nice discount to new, which sells for $3,800. I'd suggest the 24 f3.8 Elmar if a full-frame 35mm field of view is how you see the world for that M8, and you had the budget and inclination to go native. When you can find one, they're generally selling used for anywhere not much less than when they were new to as much as new, sometimes more. Hold that thought. Then again, if you told me you prefer the 35mm field of view to the 50 on a full-frame M, I'd just as easily tell you again, go for the 35 Cron spherical and enjoy. The image quality difference between this Cron and the mighty $9,000 Apo Summicron M on a film M or digital M with 24 megapixels or less, unless you are pixel peeping for the sake of pixel peeping, especially if you're not shooting color and only black and white, is unlikely to convince most of us to pony up for the Apo. Although at 40 megapixels and color, oh baby, the Apo exists, and you can see that it exists on another plane. What about earlier pre-aspherical versions of the lens? Nope, not if you're like me. Shooting with an M, for someone like me, is less about lens character than optical and mechanical precision. One can always add character in post more easily than one can add resolution. But it is always a balancing act, and some of us may be more willing to make that trade-off. What about 28 millimeters? I'll tell you the same thing. If you can only have one lens, the 28 millimeters field of view is your jam, and you have the budget and inclination, go for it. After all, it's the focal length that Gary Winogrand and other street photographers favored. It's easier to zone focus than a 35 or 50 because of its inherently deeper depth of field. And hey, it is the focal length of the brilliant integrated 1.7 Summilux of Leica's Q series. But I think the 28 is a bit too specialized for most of us. Again, if you can only have one lens. It is also the case that I personally prefer the 24mm field of view, and in the age of COVID, Gary Winogrand style in-your-face street shooting doesn't make sense to me, anyway. Oh, and the Elmar 24 3.8 is optically superior to any 28 in the Leica catalog, past or present. Moving on to my second most often used M lens, the Elmert M92.8. A used one was the second lens I bought back in the day after purchasing my Summicron M35 f2 spherical, as I just said. And the second lens I rebought in 2020 after first picking up the Summicron M50, this time instead of the 35. The Elmert is the only lens I've ever bought twice. I paid just about $1,000 each time. chalk up the utility of the 90 as a second lens over a 35 or a 24, given that I already had a 50, to my penchant for street portraiture and the social distancing required in the era of COVID. Which is not to say I don't want or feel the need for a wider field of view on occasion. I do. It's just that for now, I've got 35mm covered with my Apo Summicron SL on the SL2, and would rather wait until I buy a high-resolution M and then get the 24 LMR. I am getting very, very close. While the Elmarit doesn't have quite the speed or shallow depth of field of the also no longer in production, call it plain Jane Summicron M90 F2. In other words, I'm not talking about the new $5,200 Apo Summicron M90. This is another brilliant lens. The Elmarit is, like the 50 Cron compared to the 50 Lux, smaller, lighter, less expensive, optically superior, and blocks less of the finder than either Summicron or Summilux 90. The Elmarit is easier to focus than any of the 90s wide open too. At its maximum aperture of 2.8 at 4 feet, a nice tight portrait field of view, the Elmarit delivers 1.1 inches of depth of field, still pretty darn shallow, versus 0.8 of an inch for the F2 Summicrons and just 0.6 of an inch for the f1.5 Summilux at their maximum apertures. And while the Apo Summicron 90 F2 and Summilux 90 1.5 are optically superior, this advantage recedes into irrelevance if focus is off by the length of a gnat's eyelash. Well, literally between 0.3 and 0.5 of an inch, but at somewhere between 1/5 and 1/13 the price of the new Sheriff in Town alternatives, I've chosen to live happily with my Elmarit, especially when I stop it down a bit. Although even wide open, the little engine that could did give me images like this. Mated, in fact, to my 10 megapixel M8. What if you want higher optical performance than the Elmarit? Don't mind size, weight, price, or finder blockage to get it, but can't swing for the current Summicron or Summilux 90s, new or used? Have I got a lens for you? Let's talk about Leica's Apo Telit M135 3.4 before the Elmar 24, even though I'd use the Elmar more often. Now, the Apo Telit can be used, if you're lucky, for just about half the price, maybe a little less of a new one, which is to say about $2,000 rather than $4,500, although even then it's still twice the price of a used Elmarit, at least as we're recording this. But hey, the Apo Telit is one heck of a lens. Uber crispy, uber well corrected, with the field of view, as I've already mentioned, that is my favorite for portrait work, black and white or color. New, the Apo Telit M is just about 1/3 the price of a new Lux 91.5, although yeah, right, you are giving up 2.5 stops to the Lux, but I don't care. What I'd gain in lower ISO, I just as likely lose by misfocusing in low light. Sensors are now capable of incredible results in higher ISOs than any film available, and used, the Apo Telit costs about 1/7 the price of that Lux new. The Apo Telit is marginally easier to focus than the Lux or Crons, with a depth of field wide open at f3.4 of a slightly more reasonable 1.3 inches for the same object size, that is at 6 feet from the subject rather than 4 feet, compared to any of the 90s at their maximum apertures as articulated just a few minutes ago. In other words, I'd personally still go for the Elmarit 92.8. And I did. But if you ever find an Apo Telit M in excellent or mint condition at a fair price, don't already have a 90, don't mind the size, weight, higher price, and greater finder blockage, and want to go native, grab it. Finally, let's talk about the Elmar 24 3.8 I keep going on about. As I said, this is the third lens in my personal first among equals ranking of the only actual Leica lens trio you'd ever need for Leica M. Like its two playmates I already own, the Elmar is small, light, optically superb, and perfectly matched to the M with minimal finder blockage. It is sharper than the generally held as more desirable Summilux 24 1.4, smaller and sharper than the 2.8 as well. Unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, Leica recently stopped making them after just 12 years. That means two things. First, there aren't that many of them used. And second, when they do come on the market, they are, as I also said, somewhere between not much less expensive and slightly more expensive than when they were available new. No matter, I'd still buy this over the 2.8 or 1.4, and I'd buy it over any of the 28s or any of the 35s. That, of course, is a personal preference, as I like room between my primes. Things are a little bit different when it comes to M bodies. Again, from where I sit, I don't have as strong a sense of favorites or best values so much as a relatively cool detachment about what makes the most sense. So here we go. First, I'm going to tell you what you probably already know, immediately followed by a recommendation that many of you may not like. I apologize in advance if that's how it lands for you. But the least expensive way to get into an M mount body is a used film body, a used Leica CL. But the CL is most assuredly not an M. And I wouldn't bother in either case. I'd go straight to digital. Unless, of course, your primary reason for wanting an M is collecting or occasional photographic outings rather than shooting day in and day out. Or, as I said earlier, simply the process of shooting and developing film rocks your boat. All good. In which case, fine, let's go down this rabbit hole. That is film M bodies. You've got a number of choices, beginning with the non-metering full mechanical film M's, like the original M3 and subsequent MP, though with their 0.92x magnification finders, 35mm lenses required matching goggles because the viewfinder alone didn't cover the entire field of view of a 35. The slightly decontented, lower magnification, lower priced M2, which on the other hand eliminated the need for those goggles. The M4, which was the first M to sport the angled rewind crank, the newer advanced lever, and easier film loading system, 35, 50, 90, and 135mm frame lines, and minor revisions to secondary controls. The M4-2, which added a hot shoe, stronger gears for motor drive, but for the purists among us, only had it painted on Leica word mark on the top plate and was made in Canada, a whole other story for another time. And the M4P, which like the M42 only had a painted Leica word mark on the top plate, but added 28 and 75mm frame lines, and in fact could be thought of as the non-metering proto M6, or film M's with internal metering, beginning with the ill-fated M5. Ill-fated because it didn't look exactly like an M or feel like an M as the world had come to expect it. The ever-popular M6, which first came to market in 1984 and with its many tweaks was produced until 2002. And the M7, which immediately followed the M6 and offered aperture priority auto exposure until production ended in 2018 and relied more than any other on batteries. I wish I could tell you which of these M's is the budget gourmet pick, but it really comes down to your preferences and budget. From where I sit, there is no clear value winner. You could argue that the absence of a meter is a no-go, but in the age of iPhones with built-in camera apps, including light meters, you could also argue it's completely unnecessary. If you shoot with a 28mm lens, on the other hand, you'd probably want to limit your search to the original M4P and newer, irrespective of metering. Okay, fine. I lied. The M4P probably is the most cost-effective way to get into a real M body, although if you forced me to choose for myself, I'd probably opt instead for the earlier M4 with real engraved top plate and just tell myself I'd never shoot wider than 35. No, I wouldn't. Yeah, I might. Except I'd blow straight past 28 to 24 anyway, and then any of these M's would require an accessory finder. Feh. Back to the beginning. I'd just go digital. The advantages of digital workflow are simply too compelling for me, beginning in this very instance with the utility of an optional EVF, or at the very least a rear LCD panel, so I wouldn't need an optional finder, which, by the way, would once again separate focusing from composition. The fascinating thing, using a digital M, is that it would obviate the need to really learn how to use a meter. Because if you don't know how to really use a meter, if you rely solely on what a camera meter tells you without regard to a close inspection of precisely what you want to expose for and what exposure dynamics you have within your frame, there's a really good chance you'll blow the shot, especially if you're committed to film and don't have your own darkroom to fix it during printing. An EVF or rear panel, what you see is what you get. Then there's a dramatically shorter turnaround time from capture to review and print. That is the power of immediate feedback loops to improve one's image making, or improving the hit rate. Marginal cost per frame, The freedom from having to finish one roll of film before switching to a different roll of film for different looks, different color balances, never mind color versus black and white, since all of this can be done in camera with digital, to even, in the end, image quality. Digital now exceeds film. It has for quite some time. So let's really get into the digital M's. The problem, as I see it, is that it is not until we get to the first M10 that we get past the era of digital M's as a continuing work in progress toward a truly satisfying, really very little compromised digital M. You now know that the first M I ever bought was the 10 megapixel M8. I never bonded with it, even though I got some truly wonderful shots with it. It wasn't that the M8 is a tad bulkier than a film M, although it is. It wasn't that resolution was too low at 10 megapixels or that the sensor was not full frame, but instead an APS-H format with 133 crop. It wasn't even that the sensor's IR sensitivity was such that one had to use an IR filter, or that because of this, it was quickly superseded by the M8.2. More than anything else, it was that its low light performance was little better than film, and taken altogether, my far bulkier 5D Mark II with autofocus was simply much easier for me to get more keepers. With this said, that is because of these issues, I'd assert that used M8s, the originals, are the lowest price, lowest risk way of entering the digital M fold. I've seen a number of them selling in the $1,500 to $2,500 range and made it to a 35. As I said earlier, you've got a 50 millimeter field of view. I'd avoid the 18 megapixel M9, Leica's first true full frame M, because of the sensor corrosion issues for which it is well known and for which Leica recently finally ended its sensor replacement program, and KEH cannot warranty their performance either. ME Type 220, a bare bones M9. I simply don't know much more about it than that, but it uses the same sensor, so I'd pass. The M240, called the M or MP. Better bets, bigger battery, first of the full-frame digital M's to use a CMOS sensor, first to offer live view, first to offer an EVF, video. The MP added the classic Leica engraving on the top plate and was supposed to offer weather resistance too, which I personally believe every M should have, and I'm not sure that I believe that the MP has it. I don't know. Some people swear by the M240 series, and this series doesn't have the sensor corrosion problem. It's true. So you can expect used M240s to sell for about $1,000 more, sometimes much more than an original M8. On the other hand, I personally don't like the EVF implementation, and the EVF is important to me. I've talked about this before. We'll circle back to it again in a bit. What about the M262? No video, no live view, aluminum top plate instead of brass. Now, I don't care about video on an M. In fact, I prefer it to be absent altogether. And I'm not committed to brassing and therefore don't necessarily mind an aluminum top plate. But I would not want to give up the live view if I were looking beyond the M8. All of which is to say, really, that this digital Leica M bodies is where budget is an especially relative term. Personally, I'd go straight to a used original 24 megapixel base M10, which at launch in 2017 was priced at $6,600. I'd be tempted to hold out for the M10P because of its even quieter shutter and touch screen, but the truth of it is I'd go for the P because of its top plate engraving. The absence of that top plate engraving feels like something less than the full Leica experience. So much for being coolly detached. Well, except that an M10P would cost another $1,000 or $2,000 for that engraving, and okay, even quieter shutter, a touch screen, a built-in level, and I think that's it. Which is why I'm sticking with my suggestion for going with an original M10. What about a used M10D, the model I almost bought new until I opted for an SL2 instead? I loved it. I loved the vestigial advance lever that I used as the brilliant thumb rest it is today. I loved the top plate engraving as I always do. I loved the M10D as the purest M shooting experience from a modern perspective due to the absence of a rear screen altogether. But the allure of a high-resolution integrated EVF, 47 megapixels, IBIS, weather sealing, a far lower retail price than a new M, even better glass, along with my conviction that the SL2 system really is the new Leica flagship, and that I'd simply get more keepers, swayed me to the SL2. It also turns out that a rear screen on an M is a really useful thing to have as a way of positively concluding a momentary encounter on the street with someone whose image you've just captured. I learned that without a rear screen, I especially relied on the VisoFlex Type 20 EVF to make sure I'd gotten what I wanted in or adjacent to the moment. And a used M10D, when you can find one, same sensor, same processor as the base M10, will usually set you back an additional $1,500 to $2,000 over that original M10, maybe more. In any case, the M10 line has a number of advantages over every digital M which preceded it. First, it returns to the original, more svelte dimensions of the M6 film camera. May sound silly to some, but it does indeed feel nicer in my hand than the M8. Second, it has the same simplified 3-button layout on the rear present on the Q2 and SL2 series. It is much cleaner. I like it much better. Unlike anything before it, the entire M10 line accepts the Type 20 VisoFlex tiltable EVF, which connects directly via the M10's hot shoe rather than a separate port on the backside of the top plate, as the previous EVF did on the M9 series. I personally deem a good EVF as a requirement for critical focusing at any focal length, but especially important for lenses longer than 50 or shorter than 28, at which point most of us would otherwise need, I've said this before, or at least benefit from an accessory finder for composing. I don't know how many times I've already mentioned this. On the other hand, yes, the battery in any M10 variant is small. There is no weather sealing, but then there's no weather sealing on any M lens. The Type 20 VisoFlex is definitely in need of an upgrade. It needs to have greater resolution, greater contrast, and less smearing. Still, at these prices, a used base M10 represents somewhere between a 25 and 40% discount over the original launch price, and as much as a 55% discount compared to the latest 40-megapixel M10R or monochrome. As long as you don't need more resolution and have the wherewithal, a basic M10 is the champagne taste on a beer budget way to go for digital, though again, 4 or 5 large is hardly a beer budget, and you can get a film M for less than half the price. Just don't shoot with that film M too much, or that price advantage will disappear. Okay, let's wrap this up, because if you made it this far, more than 7,000 words I counted, you're probably almost as exhausted as I am, maybe more so. Yet, I've only covered the first of 3 legitimate ways to buy into the Leica M experience for less. And in the end, I recommended just 4 lenses in one body. There are many other less expensive paths to great imagery. As I said at the outset, when it comes to Leica and budget gourmet options, it really is all relative. So, right, for me, personally, absolutely the purest, highest performing, most satisfying, best bang for the buck, most closely aligned with the original Leica M experience setup, as seen by someone, not just me, but anyone who embraces the past yet appreciates and relies upon the many advantages of a modern digital workflow, especially for street photography, which one can argue is, if one had to choose, the genre for which the M is best known and loved, and I'd agree with you, consists of the Elmar 24 3.8, Summicron 50mm f2 5th generation, and last generation Elmar at 92.8, all mated to a used Leica M10, all in top, excellent, or mint condition. But next time, I'm going to show you how, if you're willing to buy different, as I said at the outset, by purchasing Leica compatible but not Leica lenses and or bodies, you can save even more. And if you're willing to think differently, you can save even more than that and have a more powerful and capable imaging solution than anything we've discussed thus far. Though, this does not mean that buying Leica's new, if one can afford it and is so inclined, doesn't have very real rewards. It does. Yet another story for another time. I'm done. For 3 Blind Men and an Elephant, I'm Hugh Brownstone. Thanks for hanging in with me. See you next time. A big shout out to KEH for sponsoring this video, a great resource for finding just this kind of gear. Check them out by clicking on the links in the description below and get 5% off when you buy using the discount code HughShop, a 5% bonus when you sell using the discount code HughBonus. I have got to get them to change that discount code. If you like what you've seen here today, please give a thumbs up, subscribe, join the conversation below, because this is an incredible audience. If you'd like a copy of our Streets of New York, the book, head over to www.3bmep.com/books. If you'd like to schedule a one-on-one video session with me for a portfolio review, explore or hone your artistic voice, select gear, and more, sign up at www.3bmep.com/booking. Finally, consider supporting our work by using our no-cost-to-you affiliate links down below, picking up some official Three Blind Men and an Elephant swag at 3bmep.threadless.com, sending coffee money via PayPal, or best of all, join us as a patron over at Patreon. However you choose to support us, as always, we thank you for it.